The day is March 17th, 1976, in the communist regime of Czechoslovakia, and a total of 27 musicians have just been arrested. Their crime? Playing in an underground festival held less than a month prior. A great deal of these musicians came from the headliners of the festival. These trials resulted in the arrests of several members of this band, and sparked outrage from a great number of Czech people, who included a number of writers, professors, and other Czech intellectuals, and it lit a fuse that would culminate 13 years later in the Velvet Revolution, who freed the people from Czechoslovakia from their oppressive regime. So who was this band that unknowingly became an important member of this revolution? Well, their name was the Plastic People of the Universe, and this is their story. Our story begins in 1968, with the group being founded by bassist Milan Hlavsa, also known as Mila. Now, I want to preface this video by stating that there will be a lot of names in here that are going to be hard to pronounce, and I'm by no means a linguist, so I cannot guarantee that I'll be able to do a great job. But I tried doing a better job at researching the pronunciation of these names, so that things don't turn out the way they did on the video that I made on Angus McLeese, where so many of you correctly pointed out that I bottled the name. Now, with that being out of the way, Mila was initially joined by Michal Jernik on vocals and clarinet, Jiří Przemysl Števich on guitar, and Josef Brabec on drums. The group took their name from the song Plastic People, from one of Mila's greatest musical influences, the Mothers of Invention. The previously mentioned lineup was volatile, however, and just 2 years later, it had already changed to the point where Mila was the only original member remaining, with the remaining lineup consisting of Josef Janicek, who, depending on the source, was either a guitarist, a vocalist/keyboard player, or both, viola player Jiří Kabeš, and drummer Pavel Zeman. But one of the biggest additions to the Plastics, which was their nickname and what I'll call them from now on since the name is very long, was not one of the band members, but their manager, Ivan Yirus, who influenced the artistic direction of the group tremendously, having been the one who introduced Mila to Janicek and Kabeš. It was also Yirus who decided that the group's lyrics should be in English, since, according to him, English was the lingua franca of rock music. Paul Wilson, a Canadian grad student from Oxford who had come to Prague in 1967, was chosen to teach the Plastics English so that they could perform songs by the Velvet Underground amongst other bands. Eventually, he would become their lead singer in the year of 1970, the same year in which the group would have their musical license revoked. To understand why that happened, we need to go on a small history lesson, so bear with me for a little. In 1948, following the Second World War, Czechoslovakia, like many other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, became a communist oppressive regime, which came with the usual restrictions of liberties. I won't go into detail since I don't have the know-how to do so. However, after 20 years of oppression, in 1968, the life of Czechoslovakians, I think that's how it's pronounced, it might be Czechoslovaks, don't quote me on that, was for the first time in a long time becoming a bit hopeful, mainly due to Alexander Dubček, who in that year became the first secretary of the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. Jesus Christ, couldn't they think of a better name? There are 4 ofs in that title. But anyway, he immediately started making the country more open to the rest of the world, which was an event that became known as the Prague Spring. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union did not like this one bit, and in August of that same year, it invaded Czechoslovakia alongside 3 other communist republics, Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary, and it became a hardline communist republic once again. The Plastics were formed 1 month after the invasion, which meant that when their musical license was revoked in 1970, they had to operate in secret. As a member of the Union of Artists, Yirus could obtain permits for the Plastics to perform, even after their licenses were revoked. Although the secret police caught up to this scheme quite quickly. In fact, according to what I've read, Yirus was probably the most non-conforming element of the bunch. Quoting Paul Wilson in an interview the Plastics gave to The Guardian 7 years later, unlike other members of the band, Yirus was acutely aware of the role of culture in the history of Czech movements for independence and national assertion. This is partly what I was doing in Czechoslovakia, studying this. In the same interview, Wilson went on to tell a story of Yirus and Hlavsa trying to sell tickets for a Plastics concert and being challenged by a friend. "You can't be serious," the friend said. "The whole nation is on its knees and you guys are going around strumming your guitars." "The nation may be on its knees," Yirus retorted, "but we're not." And they remained that way, continuing to play underground and private occasions, like wedding parties, transforming them into subversive counterculture events. In June of 1972, a concert in downtown Prague was cancelled after a drunken militia began scuffling with the fans. The Plastics were banned from playing in Prague and retreated into playing more in the countryside. Paul Wilson left the band in 1972. In the 2 years he was in the group, he estimates they played around 15 times in public. However, following his departure was when one of the most important pieces of the Plastics was added: saxophonist Vratislav Brabenec. He was a bit older than the rest of the Plastics, and him joining the group influenced them in a few ways. The most obvious one was that he only agreed to join under 2 conditions: that they only played original material, and that they only write songs in the Czech language. The other one was that Brabenec proved to be an incredible musician that single-handedly altered their sound, turning it into something rather unique. According to that same Guardian article that I mentioned previously, the mutation was fundamental. As a musician, Brabenec's saxophone and clarinet had new chromatics and textures, avant-garde jazz, of the kind played by Soft Machine. Slavonic dances and klezmer rhythms changed the band's musical timbre, which had hitherto combined velvet-esque rock with a distinctly Celtic edge due to Jiří Kabash's viola. Brabenec also deepened Yirus's interplay between culture and the political underground by arranging for the Plastics to release their first record in France, based on lyrics by the outlawed writer Egon Bondy. The album was entitled, wittily but in deadly earnest, Egon Bondy's Happy Hearts Club Band. At the same time, a large underground movement was forming around the group, mainly concentrated on small villages which were less controlled by the communist government. As a result, most of the activities and whereabouts of the Plastics members were tightly monitored by the police, which led to a large number of hiccups with the law, the biggest one being the České Budějovice massacre. It happened in early March of either 1974 or 1975, according to different sources, when the Plastics were set to play in the small town of České Budějovice. However, when thousands of fans arrived, they only found the police and the military waiting for them. Quoting Paul Wilson in an interview he gave to The Independent, the mayor of the town called in the border guards, basically the army, and they shut everything down and herded all the fans to the railway station and forced them onto trains. When they were on the trains back to Prague, They would take pictures of them, fingerprint them, and in some cases, book them. The Czechs call it the Budějovice massacre because there was a lot of bloodshed. No one died, but the police were quite violent. You go to a railway station and go under the tracks to a particular platform, and in that tunnel they were just beating people up. Although the chokehold on the plastics was growing tighter and tighter, they pressed on. In late 1974, Jirus, who had in the meantime convinced the other members of the band that they were doing something that was historically significant and extremely important, organized the first festival of the second culture in a village called Postupice. He later organized the second music festival of the second culture on February 21st, 1976, in the small town of Bojanovice. That went tremendously well. According to Paul Wilson, there was a sense of something happening in a world where nothing interesting was happening. A sense of joy and delight and sheer enthusiasm. Someone sent me some pictures from that show, and you could see in the people's faces that they were absolutely riveted. It was, we're doing something that's not allowed and getting away with it. It was just electric. But there was definitely a sense of foreboding because the police didn't show up. That was very suspicious. We said, something's in the air. Wilson was unfortunately correct, since this show ended up being the straw that broke the camel's back. On March 17, 1976, the country's secret police arrested a total of 27 musicians, including all of the plastics, confiscated their equipment, and interrogated over 100 fans present at the festival. A few months after, in September, the trials came. Quoting Paul Wilson, "It wasn't an open trial, so people who wanted to show solidarity with the band came to the courthouse and sat in the foyer, or were milling about. There were people from the underground, the usual suspects with long hair, and then there were philosophers and dissidents and writers. They were sitting around talking to each other. This was a point of contact that had never happened before. The intellectuals came out in defense of these young people, and they discovered that it worked. There were quite a few people dropped from the original indictment, and they realized that instead of getting horrendous sentences like 5 or 10 years, they were given basically slaps on the wrist. They treated that as a victory, because it could have been much worse. That was when the discussions began about taking the next step, and the next step was Charter 77. Like Wilson stated, most of the charges were indeed dropped, but not all of them. 4 musicians, including Jirus and Brebenec, still received prison sentences, albeit relatively small ones. It also probably helped that although the Plastics were a counterculture group, their lyrics weren't criticizing the regime. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to last that long without going to trial, of course. Like Brebenec stated in a previously mentioned Guardian interview, "I am no less dissident now than when I was then. Why should I be? Our identity as a band was to do with poetry, not politics. We were more artistic than political. I am one of those whose cultural actions, not political actions, were sufficient to make me a subversive. The politicians made us political by being offended by what we did and the music that we played. I don't know how many musicians in modern times have been imprisoned because their music offended the authorities, but we are among them. And although it is rather more comfortable for us now, we are still a cultural and artistic dissent against the norm." The fact that there were still people convicted was enough to anger one of the intellectuals who had met up with Jirus a few weeks prior and supported the Plastics cause. His name was Václav Havel, and he would end up becoming the last president of a free Czechoslovakia and the first president of Czechia, and appalled by what he had seen, formed a civil initiative alongside a group of activists called Charter 77, publishing a manifesto in early January of 1977. This landed Havel and more than 200 other activists in prison. The regime had also effectively had enough with the plastics. Wilson, who had been in Czechoslovakia from time to time, was deported, and other members left the country. Among them, Bremenets, who had been subjected to 80 or 90 3 to 10-hour interrogations, which involved some forms of torture, and threats to kidnap his 2-year-old daughter. Still, the band carried on until 1988, when disputes among the band members caused the group to disband. Hlavsa formed Polnok and carried on playing in them for the following years. The Velvet Revolution took place in 1989, ceasing the oppressive regime once and for all. The Plastics played a one-time gig in 1992 with an older lineup, which was released as a live album. By all accounts, it was a one-time affair. However, in 1997, the now President Havel asked the band to play a show celebrating the 20 years of the Charter 77, which they happily obliged to. This marked the return of the group, who carried on playing shows for the following years, one of them at the White House in 1999, and even playing with their idols the Velvet Underground throughout the 90s, as Polnok and as the Plastics. Unfortunately, in 2001, founding member Míla Hlavsa passed away at 49 years old from lung cancer. In this video, I didn't mention him a lot so far, instead talking often about Vidus and Brebenets, but to say that he was vital to the Plastics would be a massive understatement. He was the founding member, only continuous member of the band from beginning to end, and the main songwriter, so he was by far the most important member of the group. Just wanted to clarify that. But anyway, when he passed away, the other members understandably were hesitant to carry on without him, but eventually decided to do so in his honor, doing so to this day. And that was the story of the Plastic People of the Universe, a group that, to me, almost more than any other, symbolizes the power that exists within nonconformity, music, and art in general, to rally people, uniting them against oppression and in search of a better world. I want to leave you with the words of Lou Reed regarding the Plastics, since I think he surmises this issue better than I ever could.
It must be very extraordinary and emotional. Havel is the president now. The Plastic People exist in one form or another, mutating through this entire hard-to-believe scenario in which a playwright becomes the president of a country and encourages the very music that in other countries is being banned left and right. It's incredible. And finds a home or receptive audience, perhaps because they're so concerned with freedom and themselves are being banned, except far harsher banning. People go to jail. No one went to jail over here over that. They put you in jail for other things, but not for music. To go to jail over lyrics and music, that's fantastic. So my admiration for the Plastic People is unbounded, and my heart goes out to them.
I wanted to give credit to this Czech user who suggested I'd make a video on the Plastics, since this wasn't an idea of mine, but I can't seem to find the comment. I don't know if it was deleted or not, so wherever you are, man, thank you. I had no idea about any of this before I started researching, and I was thoroughly fascinated by the history of this band. And I hope you were too. I've included some articles and blogs that I checked in the description below, so go ahead and read them as well, since there are more details that I wasn't able to cover in this video. And that's it. My name is Joe Fiki, and I'll see you later with another video. Bye bye.